Back with another video, recording some post-read thoughts. I just finished reading The Cabinet by Lindsay Chervinsky. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the last name right, but that's what I would guess. And the subtitle is George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution. I've talked about it on other videos. I'm extremely fascinated by early American history, and I was intrigued when I saw this book pop up. It was either Goodreads or and like an Amazon like suggested book based on like other stuff that I've read, and I was intrigued by it ever since I saw it because I haven't exactly I was like I haven't read a book like on this specific topic, and yet I think it's so interesting. So I was excited to read it, and I very much enjoyed it. I had never heard of this author before, and I saw that she more recently wrote a book on John Adams' presidency, so I also bought that, and I plan to read it soon. I think she has a really, really good writing style. I think there's some great analysis in this. I I do think at times it can steer a little towards maybe like the academic side, which is not it's not a knock per se. It's just that there's at times with the analysis you get kind of a lot of information, and I think another part of it is it doesn't all necessarily flow like in a continuous narrative, like in chronological style. It's more so you kind of talk. She talks about like specific events, like as an event and then another event, and sometimes you can get kind of crossover of like things that have happened or like a particular person's involvement in a certain event or something like that. So obviously George Washington has a very famous cabinet with just some of like the most decorated people to ever fill those offices. But I expected what this book was going to be was basically just highlighting each individual and kind of their main accomplishments. But what I think was really interesting is she really talked mostly about the cabinet like as an institution and how it was obviously nascent because of, you know, Washington's presidency basically being the trailblazing force behind not only this, but so many other precedents, you know, at really the forming of our republic, especially the executive branch that he led. And she talked about how through kind of his leadership and decisions along with the early cabinet members, it really shaped what this institution became over time. And so that aspect of it I thought was pretty brilliant. She effectively starts out, I guess the structure of it goes, it starts with basically talking about the Revolutionary War and some of our main characters' involvements in it. So obviously Washington and Hamilton and Henry Knox are at the fore. And it's basically what she's trying to do is she's trying to discuss like certain events that happened and how they kind of learned from it, and they took that experience forward into the early years of the American government. And, you know, a lot of this talk was about how with Washington and Hamilton, how they really struggled to oftentimes get the men or the supplies that they needed. And so both of them really were kind of forged into the thought of having a very strong executive and a pretty forceful executive government that could actually defend itself and fund itself and all that kind of stuff. And so she uses kind of examples throughout the war with how certain battles went wrong and, you know, lack of communication, again, lack of supplies and things like that to kind of drive that force. And then Henry Knox was kind of right there along with them. That's the first chapter, and it is a really good overview of the Revolutionary War. And then a lot of this book, too, does take place in the so-called critical period between the end of the American Revolution and the ratification of the Constitution. And again, I love that time period. I think it's incredibly interesting. It then moves on to, she basically in full describes each of the members of the original cabinet. And she basically devotes an entire chapter to introducing each one and kind of just highlighting some of their experiences leading up to their participation on the cabinet, and then just like some of the primary things that they did while they were a part of it. And And so obviously you've got, very famously, Thomas Jefferson was the first Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox was the first Secretary of War, and then Edmund Randolph was the first Attorney General. And some of this, they're like under the Confederation Congress, after the Articles of Confederation were ratified, some of these executive, quote unquote, departments did have leaders. But when we talk about the first this, the first that, it really means since the ratification of the Constitution and the forming of our government as we know it today. And I think she does a good job of, again, introducing a lot of their experiences. So, again, with Hamilton and Knox, a lot of their specific war experience. But then Jefferson and Randolph, more political. They were governor figures. And obviously, Jefferson is a very famed diplomat serving in France and other places in Europe. And so just talking about a lot of the experience that they brought with them. Famously, Jefferson would lean towards... he would found basically the Democratic Republican Party that would oppose Hamilton's Federalist Party. And she talks about kind of some of his influences and why he learned to feel that way with a more strict interpretation of a constitution versus the Federalists that were a little bit more loose. And from there, it goes to the next chapter is called Setting the Stage. And that's where basically she talks a lot about the critical period and why there were so many things that happened that kind of pushed the need for this type of institution to exist. She, in particular, she highlighted Shays' Rebellion. That really is what prompted the Constitutional Convention and kind of the rethinking of, again, basically just showing how the Articles of Confederation were weak at, it didn't really allow the federal government to enforce much of anything. It called for states to, tax their citizens, but then there was no avenue of which the federal government could actually collect said taxes for the overall government from the states. And Hamilton, actually, he for a time after the Revolutionary War served in New York as one of the requisitioners that would actually go and try to collect payments, and talked about how extremely difficult this was. And I think that, again, that plays a large part in his, because he becomes so important to the formation of the financial institution during Washington's first term. And, that's an example of something that, his experiences there kind of lead towards where he ends up politically. And there's, again, Shays' Rebellion, showing how it was difficult to get a response from across, all the different states. And if there was going to be any kind of ratification, or if there was any amendment that was going to happen to the Articles of Confederation, it required all 13 colonies or states to agree, and then something could be amended and then ratified, which proved to be extremely difficult. So she kind of moves through this and establishes why we ultimately got to where, again, you'd have the formation of these kind of departments over the course of that time to give some more government enforcement and oversight, and then it leads to, after the Constitution's ratified, Washington establishing his own cabinet. The portion in that chapter is one of my favorites in the entire book, where she discusses, in the course of the Constitutional Convention, a lot of the different theories or propositions that were thrown out there of what this executive cabinet was even going to look like. There was earlier talk in the book too, comparing it to the British cabinet or the Privy Council of, George III. And so a lot of the conversation was around basically a lot of key figures not wanting something to look like how things did in the British style, which obviously the colonists came to resent with a lot of the taxation without representation. And so in this discussion, she talks about how, because of that, in a lot of cases, there were small committees that were formed under the Articles of Confederation for these departments, or with states as well. And so before you could have a decision that was acted upon, you had to basically have consent across the entire committee, or at least have enough for a quorum and then a majority. And that proved to be extremely difficult, and responding to things like Shays' Rebellion and some other events that took place in the in the critical period, such as like disagreements over the use of a river between Virginia and Maryland or something like that. So really interesting discussion here of a lot of different propositions of how this cabinet would function. That's something that I think I'll revisit because it was fascinating. I think you hear a lot about a lot of the different, like proportional representation and just like the Great Compromise and things like that with the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan. You hear a lot about that in terms of how, these debates went, but not so much, I think, about how the actual like executive departments were formed. And that I think was a really cool because there were different people that thought there should be different councils and they should kind of, some should be subservient to the judiciary, some to the Senate, for example. And obviously the compromise is kind of how it worked out. And she discusses and puts the verbiage in the Constitution in some of the cases of where, for example, like it says the executive will, appoint federal officials with the advice and the consent of the Senate, or that the executive has the right to propose treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. And so it landed kind of on these things, but there weren't, obviously, we hadn't seen it in practice until Washington comes to the fore. And then so the next chapter is basically establishing the extremely early years of the cabinet, starting with Washington's presidency in 1789. I think it was interesting that he didn't really, like, quote unquote, use his cabinet in the way that we think of it, like with cabinet meetings, bringing everyone together until like a couple of years in, as some events kind of pushed things forward. And that I thought was pretty interesting. And then she talks about how over the course of the years, the cabinet as an institution really emerged as kind of a lot of firsts in the country were developing. A couple of things that I remember in particular. There were a couple cases in these chapters that I thought were extremely interesting. Like one was, there was a skirmish between the nascent U.S. military and Native American tribes on kind of the western borders of the states. And it went disastrously for the U.S. military. And so the House of Representatives basically requested like a written report from the executive and from the War Department. And Washington understood that this was the first time any of this was happening. And so how they responded would ultimately kind of set a precedent for what was going to come later in not only his own administration, but then in future ones as well. And so he was very slow and cautious and patient, determining the best method, checking with Randolph on if he agreed this is something that they should be doing. And then if so, how they would respond to it. And so that I thought was pretty interesting. There was also an interesting case where, Washington, as was his right in the Constitution, trying to appoint ministers and ambassadors and other figures in nations abroad. And there was disagreement in the House about how much or how many funds were going to be appropriated to accommodate for all of these appointments. And initially they were not basically giving Washington what he needed. And he essentially firmly put his foot down that the House should not basically be able to deny a federal appointment other than what the administration is offering. And then of course they had to be ratified by the Senate. But that I thought was interesting, kind of establishing that executive oversight and dominion kind of over those foreign appointments. So that was an interesting section that I very much enjoyed. And I know that there was one more. Let me see if I can find it, because I thought it was interesting, but I'm trying to remember. There was discussion around two. The one I was thinking of was there was differing interpretations of the Constitution as to how exactly representation was going to work in the House of Representatives in terms of the number of representatives, especially as new states came into the Union. and that was what he was discussing, using the presidential veto for the first time. And again, it was Hamilton and Knox basically approved of the interpretation of the Constitution. Jefferson and Randolph opposed it because of a more strict interpretation of the Constitution. And so again, that's just kind of like an interesting back and forth on trying to use the verbiage there and interpret it. And I believe, so that was the first use of his veto. This was in 1792. And then the House went back and basically reapportioned and fixed the bill based on what his recommendation was. And that ended up being approved. So that shows kind of like an interesting, obviously a successful use of the veto, but an interesting kind of compromise back and forth there based on differing interpretations of the Constitution for something. So that I thought was interesting. And then there were some other cases too where like this, the Spaniards were denying the right of the states to access the Mississippi River, and the British were still occupying some forts in kind of the western borders of the states. And so there were some different opinions on how that should be handled. And in each case, basically, like Washington consulted with his cabinet, but always worked to basically give the executive as much, basically as much power as they could, while obviously still being held in check by the other branches of government. So that's pretty interesting. And then the appropriations with the foreign ministers, I thought that was a very good section here. And so much of this, too, in the early years with the cabinet emerging, talks about how before he kind of used his cabinet in ways after events unfolded, at times he requested advice from the Senate, he requested advice from the Supreme Court, and basically it just like after some of these major events happened and unfolded, it kind of pushed him more and more to using his own cabinet and establishing kind of those precedents within the executive. Instead, his first cabinet meeting was 2.5 years into his presidency, which I think is a little known fact. And then basically from here, the book pushes towards a couple of big set pieces. The first is, she calls it a foreign challenge, and it's basically the neutrality crisis that led to the neutrality proclamation. And, that's the Revolutionary Wars in France. This would have been after they declared war on Britain. And then so it obviously led to a big fracturing point because you had Federalists that backed Britain and didn't want to re-enter any kind of conflict and viewed Britain as a very valuable trading partner. And you had the Republicans that decided to back France because they were our first ally in the Revolutionary War. And opposed Britain because of other factors as well. So a lot of really interesting back and forth in this chapter, and then it leads to the Citizen Genet affair, which I think is so fascinating, and all of that is covered here. And so that's a chapter that I definitely think is one that's worth revisiting. And obviously across this too, as a lot of these things are unfolding and there's disagreements, there's, this is where the fractures in the cabinet really start to come into play between particularly Jefferson and Hamilton. They really come to loathe each other. And she talks a lot about how, there was use of publications to basically attack the others. And this started to really kind of drove a wedge between Washington and Jefferson, and just he didn't like the disrespect of the leadership and the administration. And this is all described in this chapter as well. And again, it obviously ended with the neutrality proclamation, but again, there was some back and forth over how to interpret because obviously only Congress has the right to declare war. The Senate has to ratify treaties, but it was basically Washington was trying to establish that the executive does have leadership over foreign affairs, foreign policy, and that's why he was able to kind of drive the neutrality proclamation, and the reasons behind why he thought that was the best case. So this was a really good chapter. The next big set piece is called A Domestic Threat, and that's the Whiskey Rebellion. And again, this was the kind of next, those were the two big set pieces, the neutrality crisis and the Whiskey Rebellion. And most of Washington's cabinet activity comes in these two events when he needed the most, basically, advice and support. And I think this was a good overview of the Whiskey Rebellion. I think also she talked about how Henry Knox was, even though he had such a military prowess and experience, he was kind of, he had to leave to go tend to some personal matters, and he didn't end up coming back until basically after the situation was resolved, and this really drove a wedge between him and Washington, which I thought was pretty interesting. And then lastly, it ends with, she calls it a cabinet in crisis. It discusses the Jay Treaty at length, which again, there was so much disagreement and back and forth there. And it then ultimately leads to the resignation of, I believe it was Edmund Randolph. I just want to make sure that I'm not getting that wrong. Yeah, Edmund Randolph. So she also talks a lot about the turnover in the cabinet. So at some point, every single person in the original cabinet would resign. And some of that speaks to like Randolph's resignation because of a potential scandal. And then I think it's pretty unique because there were obviously disagreements between Hamilton and Jefferson. But I think Knox's case shows it too, that this truly was public service in the fullest extent of what that means before, as there's, I think, in modern day politics, way too much money involved. All these people were wealthy in their private lives, and so they were sacrificing to actually serve for the public good in this capacity. And that's where I think it's interesting that it really kind of put some of them in a tough kind of financial bind to do this, and some of them had to resign for that reason. And she talks about in this chapter, A Cabinet in Crisis, how basically all new people had to be appointed, and how it was difficult for Washington to find replacements in some cases because people didn't want the job. All that I think is fascinating. So I think like Pickering? Let me see. Timothy Pickering, I think, he became the replacement for the Secretary of War, and then he became Secretary of State after Randolph's departure. Oliver Wolcott became Secretary of the Treasury. James McHenry joined, and Charles Lee later joined, I think, as Attorney General. Yeah, so there was a lot of turnover there at the end, and I think she talked about kind of how towards the end of it, Washington didn't lean on his cabinet so much because he didn't have as many personal relationships with kind of the newer people. So he already kind of used what him and his cabinet established in some of these earlier crises to kind of just like drive decision making himself, which is interesting. And the Randolph scandal really kind of led to a lot of struggles with the Jay Treaty, and that was kind of like the last set piece. And then the epilogue I thought was cool as well, because she talked about Adams' presidency and how he carried over cabinet members from Washington's second term at the end, and then how Jefferson kind of did things completely different. So she talks about kind of differing interpretations and use of the cabinet, but how no president really deviated from the use of it. And that's really the through line throughout, is just how important Washington was at setting all these precedents in his executive leadership. And though he was not perfect, it was kind of that foresight to know that everything he did was going to have ripple effects, and his use of people that had expert opinions on and experiences in a lot of these different fields came to be so important. So I thought the epilogue was really cool. This is a book that I'll definitely revisit. I think that I would be most apt again to revisit the setting the stage chapter where she talked about kind of the actual formation of the cabinet as it gets laid out in the Constitution, and then the sections on where the cabinet emerges with some of those like back and forth with the different branches of government on certain crises that popped up, and then the neutrality crisis, Whiskey Rebellion, those set pieces, along with the Jay Treaty and Randolph's resignation. All really good stuff in here. So I very much enjoyed it. Again, there's a lot of information. It's kind of like hard to remember and decipher all of it because it's packed in there. And that's where I think it does feel a little academic at times. But I think this is a really interesting book, and it kind of fills a void of something that I just haven't really seen a book quite like it, even though there's a lot of books on the early, founding figures. So I think this was a great book. I'm excited to read her book on John Adams. I would give this book 4 stars and would definitely recommend it for anyone that's interested in, very early American history, the Revolution, the critical period, the forming of our government, and all the way. Of course, this goes through Washington's presidency, and Washington really is at the fore of so much of this book. So, if you're interested in him as a figure, I would definitely recommend it for that reason too. So, again, very much enjoyed reading it, and we give it 4 stars.